I feel bad for Korean people because they are smarter than Americans. So before I can get on and get through this, I have to say that I think Korean people, on average, are sadder than Americans, probably sadder than a lot of other countries. And when I say this, my Korean friends get a little angry and they say like, oh, they want to defend themselves and defend this idea. And then I just say, look at it like this, okay? Do this thought experiment. Imagine you grab a random American and you grab a random Korean person. I bet 8 times out of 10 that Korean person is going to be sadder than the American. And by sad, it could just mean less happy. And when you put it that way, you can kind of get the feel for it. I mean, there's other statistics like Korea has a very high rate of suicide. And when I ask my Korean friends, so once I've established that, I say, okay, let's say Korean people are on average a little sadder than Americans. And I think even sometimes Korean people are sadder than people from impoverished countries, sub-Saharan Africa and India and stuff like that. And once we've established that, I always ask, why? I ask my Korean friend, why do you think this is happening? And there's the standard answers which are true. Working too much, crazy societal pressure to be a father and going to the best school and make enough money, all that stuff. So all that's true. But there's also this problem that Korean people are generally too smart. Now that sounds like a good thing, and it usually is, but let me give you my explanation. In high school, when I was in high school, a very long time ago, my high school was 4 years long and it required 4 years of English class. In fact, it only required 2 years of math. And I think this was kind of a good idea. Now, a lot of people took more than 2 years of math. Most people who wanted to go to good university ended up taking 4 years of math. And I became a math major, so it's kind of counterintuitive that I think English class is in some ways more necessary than math class. And the biggest way is that English class breaks down this way of thinking, which I think is the core way of thinking for happiness. It's basically 3 steps. Now, when you're in English class in America, basically you read a book, step 1. Step 2, you think about it. You make your own opinions. You form your own thoughts. And step 3, you write a report about it, or an essay, or even just a paragraph about it. And I think this is the fundamental way of thinking that brings out a kind of happiness. There's a lot of ways to be happy. There's a lot of different kinds of happiness. And one of them is kind of exercising your brain, exercising your consciousness. Consciousness is so important because it's basically who we are. We're basically video cameras looking out our eyes, and what's inside our head is what's important, which is our consciousness. And we all know that exercise is good for your body, and that's a good thing. But exercising your brain and thinking is also necessary, and it leads to a better consciousness, which leads to a better happiness. And what I'm trying to describe and I'm trying to break down is this 3-step method, which is highly enforced in the American education system, which is basically step 1, take in information, okay? You have to, now in an English class, it was reading a book. And reading a book is a great way to do it, but it doesn't have to be as serious and as in-depth as reading a book. It could be watching a movie, watching a TV show, reading an article, even reading like a Facebook post that's kind of well thought out and well written. All of these things are taking in information. That's step 1, which gets to step 2, which is you have to analyze this information. You have to think about it. You have to get some opinion about it. A subjective idea of, you know what, I see what the guy was saying. I see what the guy was writing. I see what the guy was doing. And I agree in this way and I disagree in this way. In fact, I came up with this new thought, which is this other thing. Which then brings us to step number 3, which is expressing what you did in number 2 and the information you got from number 1. And this expression could be, if you're a professor, the expression would be writing an actual academic paper about it. If you were a news reporter, it would be to write an article about it. If you're a YouTuber, it would be to make a video about it. But most commonly is probably you're just going to sit down and tell your friends about it. And what's great about that is that closes the loop and brings us back to number 1, because this process of, let's say you read a book, you think about the book, and then you go to your friend and talk to your friend about the book. When you start talking to him about the book, that becomes his number 1. That becomes his source of information. Then he takes that information and he rolls around with it. It rolls within his head. And then he does his number 3, which is expressing it, and he does it back to you. And that kind of makes this back and forth conversation, which leads to this analysis of the life that we're living, which brings us an amount of happiness and an amount of joy. Socrates' most cliched line he ever said was, the unexamined life isn't worth living. If you're not thinking about the world around you, if you're not looking, snapping out of your random thought for the day and going, look, where am I? What's going on? Your life, according to Socrates, isn't even worth living. Now, the thing is, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that in America we do this all the time. In fact, one of the problems with modernity is that we end up with our cell phones and we play Candy Crush and we look at Instagram and do all this shit, and we end up not doing this 3-step fundamental process of thinking that I think brings us so much happiness. Now, when you're exercising your consciousness, the other thing I want to say is exercising your consciousness is much more important for smart people than it is for dumb people. Meaning, if you have two people and neither of them are doing this kind of mental exercise I'm talking about in these 3 steps, it's going to affect the smart person much more than the dumb person. I mean, this is almost self-explanatory, right? Like, if you have a dumb guy and he's never exercising his brain, he'll be not as happy, but he'll be okay. But if you have this imagine you have like a really smart dude, Einstein, and let's say you have this tremendous amount of intelligence, but you're never exercising it, Einstein's going to turn into the most depressed, sad human that could exist because he's just sitting there and doing nothing with that great intelligence. Now, I usually bash on Korean education system. Everyone does. Korean people, Americans, whomever. I mean, Korean teachers bash on the Korean education system. But it does do one thing. The Korean education system, which is designed to make you a suneung monster, accidentally makes Korean people really good at number 1. It makes Korean people really good at taking in information and understanding it. And in this way, I think Korean people are smarter than Americans on average. There's evidence in IQ tests. Korea ranks number 2 in the world for highest average IQ, even higher than Japan. And America's like number not so good. But, fuck IQs. I mean, just think about it the way you would think about it if you did this test again, where you took a random Korean person and a random American person, made both of them read a book in their native languages, same book, but in their native languages. 8 times out of 10, the Korean's going to understand what was in that book and know what was in that book better than the American. And this way, Korean people are smarter. And I'm not even sure that Americans necessarily do this 1, 2, 3 step more than Korean people. But let's assume that Korean people and American people both do this thinking exercise that I talk about, an equal amount. Well, the sadness from not doing it enough is going to impact Korean people more than it impacts Americans. And because of this, Korean people end up being very sad despite the fact that they're very smart. There's a bunch of potential because this Korean education system kind of fucked up certain parts. Like, I don't think Korean education system makes you do number 2 and number 3 that much. But it does make you do number 1 enough that you become really smart, but that smartness never gets exercised. And because you have a smart person, in general, a lot of smart people who are not exercising their brain, they end up sadder than people who are dumber who are not exercising their brain. And that's why I feel kind of bad for Korean people being smarter than Americans. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you hate this video, give it a thumbs down. If you love me or hate me, hit the like button. Remember, these videos come out every Friday at 7 p.m. And check out my website, parkday.com. You can join my chat room. You can see all my transcripts. You can join me on Reddit. You can get through to me in a million ways if you just go to my website. So check it out. And remember the most important thing of all. Have a super awesome day.
여러분의 지원 덕분에 이번 영상을 제작할 수 있었습니다.